Emily sat at her desk, barely paying attention to the emails piling up in her inbox. The noise of the office was just background to her thoughts, which were consumed by the same uncertainty that had plagued her for months. At 30, she had thought she would have more direction in life by now. She had recently lost her job at a tech startup, and though her current position was stable, it felt like she was simply going through the motions. As her phone rang, she answered absent-mindedly, not expecting it to be the real estate agent who would turn her world upside down. "Hello, Miss Parker," the voice on the other end said, snapping Emily from her stupor. "I'm calling to inform you that the family house has been sold." Emily blinked in confusion, her thoughts a blur. "Sold," she repeated, unable to process the words. The agent went on, explaining that the transaction had been completed days ago and that the new owners were scheduled to move in. She could barely catch her breath. Her family home, her childhood memories was gone, and she had no say in the matter. "This can't be real," she muttered to herself. She tried to remain calm, but her heart raced. This couldn't be happening. Why hadn't her mother, Diane, informed her? Why hadn't she consulted her? Diane was impulsive, and Emily had always struggled with how she made decisions on a whim, but this was different. Emily had grown up in that house. It was more than just a building, it was her history, her roots. Frustrated, she immediately dialed her mother's number, but the line went to voicemail. "Mom, what's going on? Call me back. I need answers." Emily left a message, but her uncertainty only deepened. The hours dragged on and there was still no response from her mother. Emily's thoughts began to spiral as she paced her apartment. The house, the one constant in her chaotic life, was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't understand why. With each unanswered call, her frustration grew. The feeling of losing control was suffocating. Without another word, she grabbed her keys and drove to the house. The drive felt endless, but when she arrived, it hit her like a ton of bricks. The house wasn't just empty, it was already in the process of being transferred to the new owners. Emily stood frozen in front of the house, her heart sinking. Moving vans were parked in the driveway, and workers were hauling out boxes of what appeared to be the previous owner's belongings. The house, her family's house, was no longer hers. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the reality was undeniable. Her mother had already made the decision, and now Emily had no choice but to face the consequences. As the workers ignored her presence, she stepped inside. The air inside the house felt different, almost sterile. The familiar warmth was gone, replaced by the cold emptiness of a house being abandoned. The walls, once filled with memories, now felt bare. As Emily walked through the rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost more than just a house. She had lost her connection to her family's history. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. She needed answers, and she needed them now. But her mother was nowhere to be found. With no other option, Emily scoured the house for any clue that could explain what had happened. That's when she stumbled upon an old box in the attic, tucked away behind old furniture. Inside, there were old letters, photographs, and documents. As she flipped through them, one document stood out, a letter from her late grandfather. The letter mentioned her as the legal heir to the house, with specific instructions for its care. Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the evidence that could change everything. But how had her mother managed to sell the house without telling her? Emily clutched the letter tightly, her mind reeling. Her grandfather's wishes were clear, and she was the rightful owner. But the reality of the situation was that her mother had sold the house without consulting her, without even informing her. Emily knew she couldn't let this stand. The battle was just beginning, and she was ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. The house, her family's legacy, would not be taken from her without a fight. Emily sat at the kitchen table, the letter from her grandfather still clutched tightly in her hands. Her thoughts were spinning, trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how disconnected she'd been from her family's affairs. Her mother, Diane, had always made decisions on her own, but this felt like a betrayal. How could she have sold the house without telling Emily? As the reality of the situation sank in, Emily felt a surge of anger. Her mother had never taken her seriously when it came to family matters. But this was crossing a line. Emily's mind was racing as she paced around her apartment. She needed answers, but where could she even begin? The house had been sold, and now all she had were questions that no one seemed to have the answers to. Why hadn't Diane consulted her? Why hadn't she been a part of this decision? And most importantly, why hadn't her mother ever told her about the family's estate? Emily realized that she had been out of the loop for far too long, distracted by her own life, and her mother's secrecy had allowed her to make such a drastic decision without Emily's knowledge. She had underestimated how much control Diane had over the family. Determined to find out more, Emily decided to go through her grandfather's old belongings, searching for anything that could shed light on the situation. She had never paid much attention to the family documents or the history of the house. It was always just part of the background noise in her life. But now, with everything on the line, she needed to dig deeper. She found the old box in the attic, full of dusty files and faded photographs. It was a trip down memory lane, but it also felt like stepping into a trap. The house wasn't just a home, it was a legacy. And now it seemed that legacy was slipping through her fingers that as Emily rifled through the papers, she came across a folder tucked away at the bottom of the box. It was thicker than the others, and it looked important. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a series of legal documents. The first one that caught her eye was a will, signed by her grandfather. It stated, in clear, bold letters, that Emily was the legal heir to the family property. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read the document, each word sinking in. There it was, the proof that the house was hers. But if the house was hers, then how had her mother managed to sell it? As the truth started to settle in, Emily felt a rush of emotions. Her grandfather had left her the house, yet her mother had taken it from her without a second thought. Diane had always been impulsive, but this felt deliberate. Emily's heart ached as she realized that her mother had used her emotional fragility to her advantage. Diane had known Emily wasn't attached to the house, yet known that Emily's life had been too chaotic for her to care about such things. But that didn't give Diane the right to make decisions that would affect Emily's future without her consent. With the revelation of her grandfather's will, Emily felt a new sense of determination. The house, her grandfather's legacy, was not going to slip away just because her mother had decided it was no longer worth holding on to. Emily knew she had to act fast. Her next step was clear. She needed legal help. She needed someone who could make sense of the documents and challenge her mother's actions. But Emily wasn't sure where to turn. She had never been involved in legal matters before, and the idea of going up against her own mother was overwhelming. That's when Emily remembered Judith, an old family friend who was a lawyer. Judith had always been quiet and reserved, but Emily had respected her professional abilities. She had a reputation for being no-nonsense and thorough, someone who wouldn't back down in the face of injustice. Emily had kept in touch with Judith over the years, but they weren't particularly close. Still, she knew that if anyone could help her navigate the legal complexities of the situation, it would be Judith. Emily grabbed her phone and called her, hoping that the lawyer would take her case. Judith agreed to meet with Emily the next day. When they sat down together, Emily laid out the situation, showing her the letter from her grandfather and explaining what had happened. Judith listened intently, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she spoke. Your mother may have acted in haste, but she can't just sell a property that you legally own. If your grandfather's will is valid, and there's a document transferring ownership to you, we have a case. Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was on her side. Judith's calm demeanor and clear understanding of the situation gave Emily the confidence she needed to fight for her family's house. This battle was far from over, but now Emily had the right ally in her corner. The courtroom was silent as Emily sat nervously in the wooden chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. The battle for the family house, her grandfather's legacy. Diane, her mother, sat across the room, poised and composed, trying to maintain the appearance of control. But Emily could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her mother's fingers tapped on the table. Diane had always been confident, but today, it was clear she was on edge. The stakes were high, and Emily was determined to fight for what was rightfully hers. Judith, her lawyer, sat beside her, whispering words of reassurance. Emily appreciated Judith's calm demeanor, which helped settle the chaos in her mind. We're prepared, Judith said softly, her eyes scanning the courtroom. The documents they had uncovered, her grandfather's will, the property transfer, were all in order. There was no way the sale could stand, not with the fraud her mother had committed. Emily could hardly believe it as the pieces fell into place. Diane had sold the house, forging Emily's signature on documents, manipulating her emotionally to get what she wanted. But now, in this courtroom, that deception would be exposed as the Judge Harrison, entered the room. The atmosphere shifted. He was an imposing figure, tall with an air of authority that made everyone sit a little straighter. His eyes were sharp, his face unreadable as he took his seat. Emily's heart pounded as he called the proceedings to order. The room felt too small, the tension too thick. Emily wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to be easy. Diane's lawyer stood up first, making his case with a confident tone that sent a chill down Emily's spine. He was trying to discredit everything Emily had presented, painting her as someone unfit to inherit the property. Emily could feel the lawyer's words cutting through the air like a knife. He questioned her ability to care for the property, suggested that she had been too emotionally distant to understand its value. It was a tactic to undermine her, to make the judge doubt her motives. Emily's frustration began to build, but she remained silent, her jaw clenched. She had to stay calm. She knew the truth, and she knew the documents would speak for themselves. The lawyer was relentless, but Emily refused to let her emotions get the best of her. She couldn't let Diane's manipulations work in this room then. It was Judith's turn to speak. She stood confidently, addressing the court with a clear, strong voice. Your Honor, we have evidence that the sale of this property was not only done without the consent of my client but was also fraudulent, Judith said, her words cutting through the lawyer's arguments like a sword. Emily watched as the judge's Expression softened slightly, his gaze shifting to Diane's lawyer. The tension in the room intensified. Judith held up a document, the will her grandfather had left, and the property transfer papers that proved Emily's rightful ownership. The look on Diane's face was one of pure shock. She had underestimated the power of the truth. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. As the judge carefully reviewed the documents, Emily's heart was racing. This was the moment that could change everything. As Judge Harrison read through the papers, his expression remained impassive. He looked up from the documents and fixed his gaze on Diane, Ms. Parker. "I'm afraid you've committed serious violations here," he said, his voice firm and unyielding. Diane shifted in her seat, her face flushed with anger, but she knew there was no escaping the truth. The documents were irrefutable. The house, the legacy, belonged to Emily. Diane's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge wasn't swayed. "This case is clear," Judge Harrison continued. "There has been fraud involved, and the sale of this property cannot stand." Diane's face twisted in frustration as she realized that all her efforts to control the situation had crumbled. She had tried to manipulate Emily for years, but now, in front of a judge, all her lies were being exposed. Emily could hardly believe it. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was gaining control. She had fought for her grandfather's legacy, and now the truth was finally being heard. Emily's emotions swirled as the judge ruled in her favor, granting her ownership of the house. It felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The victory wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming her sense of self, her power, and her connection to the past. Diane, on the other hand, was defeated, her attempts to discredit Emily falling apart in the face of undeniable evidence. As Emily walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of clarity wash over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had taken the first step in reclaiming her future and her family's legacy. The trial had dragged on longer than Emily had anticipated. The weight of each word, each argument presented, felt like it was crushing her under its intensity. Her mind raced as the courtroom buzzed with the sound of lawyers exchanging claims. Diane, sitting across the room, appeared calm on the outside, but Emily could see the tension in her mother's eyes. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone in the room was waiting for the final piece of evidence to reveal itself. Emily's heart pounded, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her whole life had been turned upside down in these past few days. How had things gotten this far? Then, the moment came. Judge Harrison raised a hand, signaling the end of the ongoing arguments. He began speaking with a quiet authority, addressing the court as the room fell into silence. "We have examined all the evidence, and I have reached my decision," he said. Emily held her breath. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the anticipation gnawing at her. She had no idea what the judge was about to reveal, but she knew it would determine the course of everything. His eyes locked on the papers before him as he continued. "The original property transfer document, signed by Emily's grandfather, is valid. It clearly states that Emily is the rightful owner of the house." The room was still for a moment. Diane's face drained of color as the words sunk in. She shifted in her seat, her eyes wide with disbelief. Emily could see the shock written across her mother's face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small flicker of victory. The judge's words were like a lifeline being thrown to her, a validation of everything she had fought for. The house, her home, was hers. Diane's attempts to discredit her, her manipulations were all for nothing. The truth had surfaced and it was undeniable. But Diane wasn't ready to give up. She rose from her seat, her voice trembling with indignation. "This document is a forgery," she declared, her eyes wild with frustration. "This is not valid. My daughter cannot be the owner of the house." Her hands shook as she pointed toward the judge. There has to be some mistake, but the evidence was clear. The signed property transfer document, legally binding, was now in front of everyone. Diane's outbursts only served to undermine her further, as the judge remained unmoved. The truth was undeniable, and Emily knew, deep down, that the battle was finally over. As the judge continued to speak, Emily's mind raced. She could hardly focus on the proceedings as everything she had worked for began to fall into place. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about something deeper, something more personal. For the first time in her life, Emily realized how deeply she had been manipulated by her mother. Diane had taken advantage of her detachment, her emotional distance, and had used that to control her, to sell the house without her consent. Emily's resentment began to grow, a quiet fury building inside her as she thought of all the times Diane had made decisions for her, assuming she knew what was best. The realization struck Emily like a ton of bricks. She had allowed her mother to dominate her life for too long, pushing her into corners and making choices for her without ever considering Emily's feelings or needs. Emily had been too passive, too willing to go along with Diane's decisions, never questioning her authority. But now, seeing the evidence laid out before her, she understood that this was her turning point. Her relationship with her mother had been based on manipulation, and the cost had been far greater than the house itself. She had been living in the shadow of Diane's will for years, and it was time to step out of that shadow. Diane's voice continued to rise, but Emily wasn't listening anymore. Her thoughts were consumed with the knowledge that her life was her own now. No one, not even her mother, could dictate her path. She felt a surge of clarity, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The house was hers, but it wasn't just the property. It was a symbol of her independence, of taking control of her own destiny. She no longer needed to rely on Diane's approval or permission to make her own choices. For the first time, Emily felt like she was standing tall, like she could finally breathe. The judge ruled in Emily's favor, officially declaring her the rightful owner of the property. As the courtroom emptied, Emily walked out with Judith by her side, her head held high. She could hear Diane's voice fading behind her, still calling out accusations and pleas, but they no longer held power over her. Emily had won, not just the house, but her freedom from the emotional shackles that had bound her for years. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it on her own terms, no longer a pawn in her mother's game. This was her victory, her life, and her future. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of loss as she walked away from the courthouse. It wasn't just the house that had changed hands. It was her relationship with her mother. Her entire sense of self. The years of emotional manipulation had left scars, but they were no longer invisible. She had seen through the facade Diane had built, and in that moment, Emily knew that her path forward would be one of self-discovery and growth. She would never be the same person she was before the trial, and though she still felt a pang of sadness for the lost connection with her mother, she was more determined than ever to build a life that was truly her own. The days following the trial were a blur for Emily. The house once lost to her was now hers again, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as she had imagined. The initial relief had quickly faded, replaced by a deep sense of unease. The property was hers legally, but the emotional cost was much higher. Diane, her mother, had yet to speak to her directly since the trial, and Emily could feel the rift between them widening. It wasn't just the house at stake anymore, it was their relationship. The walls that had once been so familiar now felt more like barriers, separating them both from a reality they no longer shared. Emily's thoughts often drifted back to the courtroom, to the day she had stood up and claimed what was rightfully hers. It had been a powerful moment, a turning point in her life, but it also marked the beginning of a new reality she wasn't fully prepared for. She had expected to feel elation, but instead, there was a lingering sadness that followed her every move. Diane had been so certain that Emily wouldn't care about the house, that she wouldn't fight for it, but now, seeing her mother's refusal to accept the outcome, Emily realized how deep the wounds of their relationship ran. Her mother had never seen her as an equal, never considered her opinion in decisions that affected their family. Diane's refusal to acknowledge her defeat was difficult to bear. Emily had hoped that, after the trial, they could begin to heal, to rebuild the pieces of their relationship. But instead, Diane seemed to be questioning her own actions, as if she regretted selling the house. It was a strange feeling. Her mother wrestled with guilt when it was Diane's decisions that had brought them here. Emily had no interest in going back and undoing what had been done. The past couldn't be rewritten. She could only move forward, but the weight of her mother's denial hung heavy in the air. Emily knew that healing wouldn't happen on her mother's terms. As the weeks passed, Emily began to settle into her role as the owner of the house. She spent time organizing the space, cleaning out old belongings, and sorting through the years of memories that had accumulated. The house, which had once felt like a place full of warmth, now felt distant. It was her grandfather's legacy, but she had never truly understood what that meant until now. As she sorted through the attic, Emily uncovered more of her grandfather's personal effects letters, photographs, and journals. Each item was a small piece of the puzzle, a deeper connection to the past that she had never fully appreciated. With each passing day, she started to understand what home truly meant. Emily wasn't sure when exactly it happened, but somewhere, in the midst of her discovery, she realized that the house wasn't just a place, it was a symbol. It was more than brick and mortar. It was a tangible representation of her family's history, her roots, and her own identity. It wasn't the house that had been lost, it had been the connection to her past, to her grandfather's legacy, that had been severed, but now, Emily was putting those pieces back together,